Ассаламу алейкум. Дорогой Хузур, вы знаете, что в Советском Союзе произошел развал всех республик.
Dear Huzur, you are certainly aware that there was a breakup of the Soviet Union, yes. So that the whole multitude of the state formations are there now.
Более того, эти сепаратистские движения начались в самой России.
And there are some trends of separatism in Russia itself.
В том числе к таким республикам относится и Республика Татарстан.
Also, among the republics which want to be and obtain independence from proper Russia, Tatarstan also is present.
Которая приняла свою конституцию.
Tatarstan adopted and enacted its own constitution.
Где провозглашает себя суверенным государством.
Where declares itself an independent state.
Это было принято большинством, абсолютным большинством в парламенте.
So there was an overwhelmingly yes vote in the parliament for this option.
Хотя есть некоторые силы, которые хотели помешать этому.
Still, there are some forces who want to oppose this.
Потому что республика сложная в национальном отношении.
Because the republic has a very complex percentage of different nationalities there. Yes.
Это около 60% татарского населения в республике.
So
остальные
we can say around 60% are Tatars and all the rest are
остальные русские, украинцы, евреи, чуваши и другие народы. Вот у нас установилось такое спокойствие. Это единственная, видимо, точка в бывшем Советском Союзе, где нет национальных расприй, нет войн, нет вражды между друг другом.
Maybe apparently it's the only place in the whole former Soviet Union where you can witness considerable calm. No wars, no animosity, no hatred. So.
Ну, дорогой Хузур, я бы хотел узнать ваше мнение о бывшем Советском Союзе, который пришел к такому упадку.
Dear Huzur, we would like to know your precious opinion about the breakup of the Soviet Union, about what brought about this breakup.
Почему это все?
Why it did happen?
Почему так получилось?
Well, you have told me some very interesting things. You have added to my knowledge of the things now going on in Tatarstan and other parts of Russia.
Вы сообщили мне очень много интересного о том, что происходит конкретно в Татарстане, и поэтому теперь я представляю более или менее вашу республику.
I'll continue.
Yes.
You know, what is happening in USSR is, number one, the failure of that cementing force which kept different nations together rather artificially. The central cementing force was that of an ideology. That ideology seems to have collapsed, and as a natural outcome of that, the different parts and bits which were held together with the cement of that ideology were naturally expected to fall apart. But that is not the whole picture. The ideology binds the people in reality as an optional force, not as a coercive force. But there are coercive forces also which bind different peoples together. Ideology works as an internal force, creating an urge for similar thinking people with the same views on life to get together under one system. Now that has disappeared. But other forces which work simultaneously are still there, which is the coercive element of state, which binds these different ethnic groups or nationalities together as one country under threat of force. So that is still intact. So there are very grave dangers lying ahead for the whole people of USSR if they do not move cautiously and wisely and slowly enough until they begin to see the way out. Because the power lies elsewhere and it is still retained by a smaller proportion of the whole people of USSR, and a larger proportion who would like to run out of that influence, region of influence, are weak as far as the real distribution of power is concerned. So that is one concern which I must share with you, and I will come to the other parts of your questions later on. There are other problems also which compound this complication because they run concurrent to the problem we have just discussed. As far as the ideology is concerned, there was not just one single ideology. There were other ideologies in USSR which ran parallel to this ideology and which were always in strife for their survival and for reassertment of those ideologies. For instance, Tataris have an entity. They have a way of life. Uzbeks have an entity and a way of life. Turkmen people have, of course, generally an identity. Now, USSR has been trying hard throughout their history to stamp out the remnants of Tatari ideology. Also, they have been doing the same for the sake of unity, as they thought. I don't blame them. I'm just telling you the facts of life. But they have not succeeded in doing so. The result is that the forces which you mention, the separated forces, are in fact the raising of the heads of these ideologies. These suppressed identities which were attempted to be wiped out, but the forces which wanted them to be wiped out for the sake of one unified greater Russia, they have failed. And they remain there, and now they have found the right climate to sprout and to flourish and to become strong. You see, the fact is that there are other forces also working. And these forces put together are confusing the issue so much that it is not possible for the common man, even for many intellectuals, to clearly see what is happening. And unless you begin to clearly see what is happening, you cannot choose your way out, because that will be a probe in the dark, just stumbling here and there and trying to find a way out. So first advice which I would render to you would be to wait calmly and begin to see until your eyes are accustomed to the new light or the lack of the light, whatever it is. And they focus accordingly, and they dilate their pupils accordingly, and then begin to see things. I feel I have somewhat a correct view of what is happening because I am viewing things from outside, from a detached angle. As such, my thinking is not as perplexed as thinking of those forces which are directly involved. So now I come to the second point. You see, we are passing through a very critical phase of history of USSR where a huge empire, a superpower, is in the process of breaking, falling apart. And when this happens, it's not only the people within that state which have their interests. People all around them have their interests. And they want to open those avenues in which they can enter and benefit the maximum from that situation. So it is not just a question of Tataris or Uzbeks or Tajiks or Russians or let's say Kazakhs. It's a question of the whole world. You are a small world within yourself, reflecting not only what is happening within you, but also you are reflecting the thinking of America, of Christian forces of Europe and the West in general. The Muslims, they are also divided, so you are in a way become reflecting mirror of the views and hopes and ambitions and greeds of these forces, which are Christian, and Muslim forces, which are Iran, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, Afghanistan, etc., etc. So things are very complicated. Now they would like, from religious vantage point, all these countries who are dominated by one single religion, although others are present, but dominated by one religion, they would like to enter through the door of religion to the erstwhile states of USSR. And they would further confuse the issue. In the name of Islam, they would like you to do this and do that. In the name of Christianity, they would like you to do in this and that. And still, you will find yourself very confused as to what Islam is and what Christianity is. Because at the same time, you will hear voices telling you, no, look here, Islam is okay, we want to also Islam, but not that Islam. Not that Islam, not that Islam. Similarly, voices will be heard from Christianity about Orthodoxy, Greek Orthodoxy and that Orthodoxy, and Catholicism and Protestantism and so on and so forth. So they are all confusions, brought upon confusions, which are facing you today. But that is not all. I'll turn to other questions or difficulties, then we'll begin to see the whole scenario, or at least a great part of that, and then we'll discuss what can be done about it. Then again, these religious interests will come into clash with your original interests, because in the name of Islam you will hear the call of unity, but unity which is only relative. A call from Iran may ask you, or may address you as the only source of light for you, the only hope for deliverance from this situation. So they would say, come and be gravitated towards us. We are going to be your saviors. We have this common spiritual force to bind us together. So come to, respond to our call and join us, and let's work together hand in hand as brothers in faith. That would be the same call from other forces like Pakistan, like Saudi Arabia, like Libya, like Syria, and so many things. Mainly, and Turkey, of course. The Turks are Hanafites mainly, and the Saudians are Wahhabis, and Pakistanis are a mixed nation. Iranians are purely, largely, not purely, largely Shiites. So there will be three different calls in the name of Islam, yet within your own territories, you will not like to be united in the name of Islam among yourselves. For instance, no amount of Islam can make Tajiks leave their rights for the sake of Uzbeks. No amount of mixing of Islam will dilute the age-long rivalries between Uzbeks and Tajiks, and between Azerbaijanis and others. So where will Islam go when the question of internal cementing of forces comes into play? So it will become a very confused issue. Similarly, you must remember that although the ideology seems to have failed, that is the communist ideology, it is not only the ideology which is at fault. You must remember that it is the corrupt administration which has in fact failed. Those who were responsible for running the ideology and looking after its safe delivery, they have failed, they have fumbled, they have been disloyal. They have become selfish, and it was bound to be. I don't blame them for that, because a godless ideology had to end up like this. But still there are a large number of people from among the Muslims, erstwhile Muslims, and the Christians, and say as in your country, from Tataris as well as from all other small groups who still stick to that ideology for their ulterior motives, if not for the sake of the truth itself. But I'll explain that after. During the breakup of Pakistan into Pakistan and Bangladesh, the Bangladeshis said, you have brought us together with you, united into one federation under the name of Islam. So if Islam is that powerful a force to unite us while we are geographically so much apart, why don't you get federated with Afghanistan and Iran? Are they not Muslims, or are you not Muslims? So there, the failure of this logic was so obvious and evident that the entire people of Bangladesh agreed with this view. It's not only the religious ideology which coalesces people and which cements them together. There are other factors involved. So the factor of communism, or erstwhile communists, particularly because this factor, it will be supported by the military factor, by the defense forces factor. Erstwhile communist leadership, which has been enjoying themselves with both hands, which has been usurped power, and which, of course, liberally help themselves with the help of that power. Now they find themselves at odds with the rest of the society, and they are waiting for their chance to pounce upon present trends of separation or present trends of rejecting the ideology. This is again a very important factor which you must consider, because what is happening now is a greater voice of disagreement and dissent with the achievements. Now, because of the failure of achievements of the present regime, there is a greater tendency to criticize the reforms. Particularly, it is exploited by the erstwhile communist forces within the defense and the outside defense as well. They say, look here, this is what you brought us to. We were better off before. Now everything has gone to the four winds, and everything is every order is destroyed. The country is falling apart. We are no longer even a third-rate power. This running away from ideology has disgraced you. So those who will push this argument forward don't have to do it only with the help of logic and convincing arguments. They hold the force in their hands. They can advance this argument later on at some stage with the full might of the defensive forces of USSR. So that is also a danger lying, casting a shadow over the potential disorder of the USSR further in the future. Now in Tataristan there would be some such elements. I don't know much in detail, but this is my feeling. There have to be such elements. They would be from all ethnic groups, and there would be Tataris among them. Among Tajiks and Uzbeks, etc., and Kazakhs, the same would be the situation. So these are the dangers, and some others I don't want to count now, which make the situation very confused, very complex, and also very explosive. You may choose a direction which seems to be good for you if you don't choose the direction with caution, if you don't practice all the precaution which is required by this situation, which is highly essential for someone to exercise during this situation, then explosions may take place anytime. So I'll now turn to the question later on as to what I suggest. If I were you, what should have I done in the view of this very complex situation? Separation has some advantages, very powerful advantages, but also it has disadvantages. So first, let us find out what are the advantages and what are the disadvantages. And separation cannot be effected in some cases with fast pace. In some cases, separation should be effected or achieved with a much slower and cautious pace than just rushing into things and trying to grab it in one run. What is the situation prevalent in USSR? That is to be analyzed, and then we'll understand what should be the policy of separation, where we gain and where we lose. Now, when a superpower breaks into smaller factions and segments, the smaller factions cannot enjoy the same power as they enjoy it being a part of the totality. A big ocean is a big ocean, and a small lake is a small lake. The small lake can enjoy a sense of sovereignty and independence, but it cannot enjoy the sum total of the benefits of a large ocean. So what are those benefits and where are they to be sacrificed? That is the question which one must address. But before that, I will begin with another point of view. I want to bring into this discussion another very important point. Why do people want to separate from a big collective power? Because it is also human tendency to coalesce, to join together, to come to greater, larger entities and larger federations, etc. Because you study the human history, and this you'll find both trends, separation and getting together, running parallel to each other. So there are factors responsible for either both different factors. We must find out what those factors are, and then our journey into the future will be much safer. Separation is always initiated by lack of trust, by ill treatment at the hand of a powerful associate, comrade, friend, or partner in the company. When these things happen, then the seeds of separation are always sowed. It is not essential that separative tendencies should be found only in big federations like federations like USSR. Within each unit of USSR, there are prevailing today, the same forces of separation. Because when we return to the question of Tajiks and Uzbeks in Tajikistan don't feel safe, and Tajiks in Uzbekistan don't feel safe. People of Armenian origin or association within this state, Azerbaijan, don't feel safe, and the vice versa. So the same factors will begin to play if you overemphasize separation. Before getting separated or raising a call of separation, first of all, you should decide how slowly you should give the call for separation. At certain periods, the central forces are weakening, and that is the time to load them with only that much demand which they can take voluntarily. You overdo that, and the reaction will begin, and the forces will think that they are benefiting from this situation to their advantage overmuch. So let's strike back. Enough is enough. So first of all, caution requires that you go slowly, like you have already done. I'm very much impressed by the Tatarian conduct in this situation. They have already made their own constitution, the very first among the peoples of USSR, the states of USSR, who have got their own constitution made within no time. That speaks volumes for their character and future potentials. They have declared themselves independent. Yet this declaration has to be accepted not only outside but within USSR states. And you have a long way to go. And at the same time, you must create a sense of security around you so that the rival forces are not threatened. You must, with your conduct, create an impression of friendliness to your erstwhile partners. Tell them this separation is not based on hatred. It's not based on a reactionary movement which knows no end to stop. It exceeds limits. All reactionary movements exceed limits. It's a wise move. We want only to safeguard the genuine interests of a people and don't want to move a step further. So with that security in the minds of the bigger, larger partner or elder brother of yours, that will help you achieve some more things slowly and gradually with wisdom and caution again. Secondly, this is impossible to achieve until you genuinely try to create an air of trust within your own country, within the newly born country. Because if you don't do that, then outside forces will instigate hatred against you by the same logic as you instigated the separative tendencies within your country against the bigger brother. They would look here, they would say, look here, Tataristan is being made at the cost of all the smaller entities. There are Russians here, there are people, Kazakhs here, and people from all different nationalities, like you said, Georgians, maybe, but which other country would you say? Within Russia? Huh? Largely found, people from which other country are largely found in Tataristan? Yes.
Well, Chuvashs.
That's right, you see. So they would begin to contact, to send their emissaries to them, and quietly and under the surface they will make arrangements that things become very difficult for Tataris to rule with as one single entity, as an emergent a nation which emerges with the Tatari concept as a whole, amalgamating the smaller forces within Tataristan. So you must work for that. The other area in which I want to give you a word of advice is the area of economy. I agree, of course, that changes have occurred, and USSR people cannot return to the same ideology entirely. But the entire ideology should not be rejected outright as a total failure. I know there are some good points in that ideology too, and there are bad points too. So you must form bodies of intellectuals from all walks of life, from people of different thinking and trends, and give them this task of finding out what changes should be brought about and how far we must change and where we must put a break, and also fix the end direction, your orientation. Ultimately we'll reach that goal, but in the meantime this should be done, not at the cost of that, and so on and so forth. Give my compliments to the people who made this constitution, because they have put an article in this constitution which is a very wise introduction regarding religious policies. It says no religious leadership would be permitted to create hatred and division in the name of religion. Am I right to understand
yes.
that?
Precisely.
Precisely, you see. So this is a very wise step, but it is not enough. There is more to it yet to be done. The danger would come from foreign influences. So far, the people are innocent. The people of USSR states, all of them are religiously innocent. Long ago, they left their feuds on the basis of religious divisions and infights. There is a history buried in the past. Now they are emerging with a clean sheet. They like each other as Muslims, and that is all. Like each other as Christians, and that is all. So that innocent must not be permitted to be destroyed by foreign influences. And you must remember that the foreign influences in religion always come with money. Powerful hands who have money, clenched in their fists, come and give to some religious clergy some money and say, you work for us, work for the good of the country, of course. But they practically buy the loyalties of these people whose loyalties are directed outside the country. So gradually, a large section of your own country will be brought under the influence of foreign countries, which will be tantamount to buying your loyalties for a religion which is controlled by a rich, powerful government. Don't let it happen to your country. For instance, in the case of an African country, a minister from one African country was sent by the president for a word of advice to me, and we discussed these things. They were very perplexed as to what we should do. I said, it's very simple. Saudi Arabia will come to you with money, could you do this? And they would ask you to let them build madrasas, mosques, etc., etc. And you will feel that dollars are coming to your aid. You can give them money in local currency, and use the dollars. So you will be tempted to accept it. But once you do it, you, with your own hands, carve a section of your own society and hand it over to a foreign country for them to rule with religious fervor and religious firmness. Practically it comes to a sort of rule. And then Iran would come. They won't tarry far behind because they are jealous of Saudi Arabia, and they will do the same, and so on and so forth. So why must you split your country into separate entities at war with each other? If this is the purpose of religion, then religion must be rejected. Religion must improve the quality of human life, quality of the society, quality of mutual trust, quality of love for each other. So no religion must be permitted to work exactly in the opposite direction. If somebody works rightly based on principles, then another person reacts wrongly, then the blame should be thrown on the reactor, not on the person who acted rightly. So this is very sensitive area where the government must keep an eye and find out who is the culprit. If a message is delivered, if a dialogue is invited and called for, you can't call it religious hatred. But if reaction to such a dialogue, reaction to such a message turns out to be violent, if people are instigated to react against this message and attempt to conversion with force, then this is the culprit which must be stopped. So the danger lies outside your territories, not within so far. Don't let it be rooted within your territories. The best formula would be, as I suggested to this minister, that you tell foreign countries who are interested in the propaganda, they should set their literature to them. They will find out whether it is worthy of publication in this country or not. They will not find out on the basis of whether they agree with it or not. No. Only from the angle of finding out if it is tantamount to creating hatred between Tatar and Tatar. Not otherwise. Even if we disagree, we'll permit you, of course. This is the freedom of conscience, freedom of dialogue, etc. And then, if you want to help some people financially, you help the government. We'll promote those religious qualities within the country with the help of your money. And in that way, you will be, it will become a government, an affair which will be a sort of, which will associate the government in the whole process, and no direct buying of your manpower will remain possible for the foreign investors in your country from the religious point of view. I know people are bought like this. The mosques are created, madrasas are created, all the people who are made in charge are paid from from outside governments, not only paid from outside governments, but paid at a level at which they cannot receive salaries from their fellow countrymen. So they become entirely dependent for the survival of their the standard of life on foreign countries. Don't let it happen. If they want to open schools, tell them, you come and help us build the schools, and not only the schools, but also economy. Not only the mosques, but also give us literature, which will create higher qualities in our morals in the society, which will cement the society in the name of religion. So these are the areas where you must insist that we will not permit foreign governments to interfere with the religious life to the detriment of the quality of our society. I do not believe that the governments should have religions under their control. That would be interference with human conscience, interference in an area where man must remain free and independent. So I don't want state control to exert on religious institutions. That is a different thing. But what I want is that a balanced policy should be framed and very firmly pursued, like the one I suggested to the President of Sierra Leone. You can turn it in that direction and see. Let them share this picture with me. You see over there, bring it to the focus. When I met him, bring it back, he very proudly mentioned to me one principle of the government of Sierra Leone. And they said, we have a golden principle. And that is that religion will not be permitted to interfere with the affairs of state. And he told me that we are glad that according to our investigation into Ahmadiyyat right from its inception, we have not discovered a single incident where Ahmadiyyat ever attempted to interfere with our state. So you're free.
It's right what we have here.
Yes, but I said this is only half a principle, please. Why don't you have a full golden principle? And he said, what is the other half? I said, the other half is that state must not be permitted to interfere with religion either. So it is a balanced policy. He's a very, I was impressed by his quality of his modesty, etc. He almost jumped from his chair. He said, yes, I agree. This is a good principle as a whole. So that is what I am advocating. The state must set this goal before her, that they will not interfere with the religious processes. Give them a free hand to develop freely in the atmosphere of a free dialogue. Anybody which attempts to hit this freedom, which attempts to create hatred in the name of God instead of love of man, which attempts to split and bifurcate the Tatari society into opponents and belligerent factors, that will not be tolerated. Yes, if they promote love of Tatarians with Tatarians and with other human beings and neighbors around, then such religions must be helped, not opposed. So freedom of religion, but not freedom to interfere with the state affairs, but not freedom to create hatred and ill will between one entity of your country and another entity of the same.
Вот, как известно, что центры ахмадийских движений открыты свыше 126 странах мира. Вот, наконец, открыли центр в Казани, в Татарстане. Для жителей Татарстана, возможно, будет интересно знать об этом движении, и, может быть, дорогой Хузур скажет несколько слов для жителей Татарстана о ахмадийском движении.
You see, Ahmadiyyat should be taken in the context of all religious sects and communities in Islam and elsewhere. Why different sects? Why communities? This is the question. It is because from their vantage point, from the angle they see a religion, they have a definite interpretation of that religion, which differs sometimes with many others of the same religion. So this viewpoint creates a community within the religion. Another scholar and his colleagues and followers begin to differ with this viewpoint because they look at the same religion from a different angle. And then another school of thought comes to be born. So far so good, because hatred does not play any role in this segmentation. It is not a force which disintegrates Islam or any religion. This is a force of truth and wisdom, freedom of conscience, freedom to hold views. But if it were left at that, then Islam would remain united despite the freedom of disagreement within Islam. That disagreement is promotive to human thought and thought process develop and flourish. That is why Hazrat Muhammad Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, referring to such types of disagreement, said, "Ikhtilafu ummati rahmatun," or words to that effect. Disagreements in my ummah are a source of blessing. So disagreements can be a source of blessing, but unfortunately they could be a source of curse. That is why the Holy Quran, speaking on segmentation, also curses these tendencies. So the Ahmadiyya is a viewpoint which emerged at the very end of the whole period of last 1300 years. It came to being 100 years ago. So after the divisions and subdivisions of 1300 years, Ahmadiyyat came to be born. Why? What new element did it bring? How far did it reform Islam, if it all did? That is the first question which you must address and which is contained in your question, you must answer. Ahmadiyyat did not come to create any reform in Islam. Ahmadiyyat considers itself totally incompetent of reforming Islam, because Islam is a perfect religion. Perfection cannot be reformed. Ahmadiyyat came to remove the additions and subtractions and revert Islam back to its pristine purity. Like a building has been changed in its form and shape and architecture by forces working in different periods. They add something here, remove something there. So the original building is no longer recognizable. So it was to rehabilitate the beauty of Islam in its entire original purity that Ahmadiyyat came. This was the purpose, this was the claim of the founder of the Ahmadiyya movement. Now we reached a stage where we find ourselves all divided and split into sects, and then turn to Hazrat Muhammad Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam for his advice. In this state of disorder and split, what can happen? How can we be brought together again? The answer given by him is the right answer, and only following that answer can save us. Now when we study the hadith in general, speaking on this topic, we come across very grave warnings, very serious warnings of split after split among ummah, and they are deviating from the right path and differing with each other on fundamentals and this and that, until Islam is left only in name, and the Quran is left only to scribe beautifully, and that is all. It has no relationship with your conduct. These are the prophecies in general which were made by Hazrat Muhammad Rasulullah. So after this ugly picture is painted, what can we do? What can we hope? How can we hope? The answer to that always was that God would take over the leadership in His own hands. He would discard the entire Muslim leadership of the period and appoint someone as Imam al-Mahdi himself. That is the only answer. It was never even remotely suggested that people of that time, with big oil-rich countries or others, they will get together themselves and resolve the issue. It is their responsibility. Let them resolve it by mustering their forces and joining their mights. Never once was this suggested by Rasulullah. He said someone will be appointed directly by Allah, and he would be the religious leader of the period, Imam al-Mahdi. And then he named the leader as Masih al-Ma'ud, the Messiah, having a re-advent, a second advent, second coming of the Messiah, having descent of Messiah. Different names are given to this process and this phenomenon, but the ultimate analysis is he speaks of two reformers. Both are divine reformers. None is elected by the people, or none is a representative of the state of Islam. It is here that the difference between Ahmadis and non-Ahmadis begin. We believe that the founder of the Ahmadiyya community is that reformer who was directly appointed and commissioned by God. And the rest of the people believe, no, this is not true. He's a false man. He's an impostor. So you're worse than before. This is the fight about. You see, the vital question every Muslim must address today is, if Ahmadiyyat is wrong, if it is a false religion, then what is the right one to which we could turn? Obviously, this should be the question. The answer to that given by Hazrat Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam himself is none whatsoever. Everybody would be surprised, but I am going to explain and support my claim by a tradition of Hazrat Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He once mentioned that there would be, like the Jews who got split into 72 sects, there will also be 72 divisions within Islam and my followers. And he said all the 72 would be hellbound. Not one will be right. Then would come one Jama'ah, which will be 73rd. And that 73rd will be the only heavenly Jama'ah which will be on the right. Now, I leave the rest of the hadith for the time being. But the logical question is very simple to understand, is that when the split reaches a stage where, if not exactly 72, in large number of sects come into being, then unless the right one appears, all the numbers available are wrong. This is the only logical conclusion. Yes, true. See, one very strong argument in the favor of my view is that when Hazrat Muhammad Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam speaks of a divine Imam appointed by God Himself, and speaks of Al-Masih, who also is a divine Imam, then it is a logical conclusion that until they come, the rest of the warring factions of the Ummah are not right. They cannot save anybody. Because their very coming, their necessity demands that the prevailing leadership and the prevailing concepts of Islam are not sufficient to deliver man from Islam, from the problems which will be besetting Islam at that period. There has to be one divine leadership added. So because apart from Ahmadiyya, none of the other sects claim they retain that direct divine leadership of Al-Masih and Al-Mahdi. So they can't be right.
the only possibility of redemption lies in a sect, in a community, which according to Hazrat Muhammad Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam is led by a Messiah, the Messiah I should say,
Yes.
and the Al-Mahdi. So because the only people in the field are Ahmadis who claim this, so either they are right and totally right because they are divinely guided, or none else is right. So the alternative is total chaos.
Now I suggest a very logical way of
Discerning the truth of Ahmadiyya for a common people, ordinary people who do not know much of religion, etc., the Quran or the Hadith, how can they judge? I will put two criterions before them.
Number one, the simple criterion of your own common sense and conscience. If Ahmadiyyat is right, the education of Ahmadiyyat has to be better than the others.
If Ahmadiyyat is right, if the founder of the Ahmadiyya community was right, that he was divinely appointed, then he should be divinely guided. Then his teachings must be beautiful and pure and impressive, and they should have the quality of sink into the hearts of human conscience, not to be at variance with human conscience. So briefly, I'll tell you what we believe, and you will understand whether Ahmadiyyat is right or wrong, as against others who differ with us in many fundamentals.
Number one, agreements. We all believe that there is no God but one, Allah. He sends books for the guidance of the people. Angels are right. There are books, and the phenomenon of books is right.
We believe in the hereafter, and we believe in the messengers of Allah. These are the five fundamental beliefs which are held by all Muslims. So that is the commonality.
We believe in namaz, salat.
First, kalima tayyibah, that also becomes a practice in Islam.
To believe in one God and to shape one's conduct in accordance with that belief. This is the meaning of that.
So in the second group of five, first kalima tayyibah, then as-salat, then comes zakat, then comes fasting, then comes hajj.
So we all agree. Differences. Now I come to that. We believe that Islam requires her followers, its followers, to spread the message of Islam with the help and logic of the Quran, not with the help of sword, not with the help of force. And the rest of the Muslims generally, I must say, like Saudians for instance, Wahhabis I should say,
they believe that the holy war is an essential fundamental of Islam, which means that you are permitted to use force to resolve your religious and ideological differences with others.
We say if you use force of any sort for propagation of your ideology, then the war initiated by you would be an unholy war. But you must propagate,
even if you are obstructed by force. And when obstructed by force, then you have a right to raise sword against sword. That is a holy war, not otherwise.
that is one fundamental principle where we disagree with them. We have a different understanding.
Secondly,
We believe that Jesus Christ was a prophet of God, a human being who died a natural death, but he did not die upon cross. God saved him, so he was redeemed from the cross in a state of a sort of coma. He survived those injuries and was seen
by his followers later on at different places. So he gradually moved away from the place where he was crucified and moved out of the influence of Roman Empire, the boundaries of Roman Empire. and migrated to other places where other earlier Israelites had also migrated. This is our belief about Jesus Christ. They believe no, Jesus Christ was so special that he had neither a father participating in his birth, nor did he die at all up till now. He was ascended, he was taken up bodily by Allah, and he is waiting somewhere in space. We don't know which star he is settled on, but according to their belief, he is somewhere in the space, in the heavens. He himself would return to revive Islam, to make Islam victorious again over all the rest of the religions. This is their belief. We believe no, it's sheer nonsense. It's unreal. He died a natural death, but though he was saved from the crucifixion. But he later on migrated to the people of Israel who had migrated earlier, administered his ministry to them, spread the message far and wide, and died a natural death. I'm not going to go into the arguments, I'm just telling you the facts of differences. And it will not be he in person who will descend from the skies somewhere. It will be somebody in his name, in his character, in his style, in his approach to problems, who would be raised by God, and he will not be any other person than Imam Mahdi himself. We believe it's a misunderstanding and misinterpretation of the prophecies, because we find it mentioned in Ibn Majah, one of the 6 authentic books of Hadith, that there will be no Mahdi except Isa. Lal Mahdiyo illa Isa. So our interpretation is exactly as mentioned in this Hadith. We believe one person will be raised from one angle of vision. He will be entitled Al-Mahdi, to lead the Muslims. From another angle of vision, because he will confront the Christian world and rehabilitate the true image of Jesus Christ. So he will be called also Christ. And this is another big difference. The third big difference is that they believe that because the Holy Prophet is entitled Al-Khatam al-Nabiyyin, it means that no prophet of any sort would ever appear in the Ummah. We say it is not a question of another prophet. It is a question of the status of Imam Mahdi as prophesied by Hazrat Muhammad Rasulullah, and the status of Al-Messiah as prophesied by Hazrat Muhammad Rasulullah. He knew the Quran better than any other mullah or any other man on earth ever to be born. What he said was that Al-Imam Al-Mahdi would come. He would be directly appointed by God, raised by God as Al-Imam. And it will be essential for every Muslim to believe in him. And we say this is the definition of a prophet. A religious leader which is directly appointed by God and to believe in him is made essential, happens in no other case but that of a prophet. So you may name him anything, but virtually, for all practical purposes, he is to be a prophet. But not a new prophet, not a prophet outside Islam, not a prophet to be able to, with the authority to change even an iota of the Quran, not a prophet with an authority to change even an iota of the word of the Holy Master, Hazrat Muhammad Rasulullah. So a prophet totally subservient to the Quran and to the Prophet of the Quran, to the Rasul of Quran. This is the Ahmadiyya view. They say no, this makes this whole believing in the Messiah and the Al-Mahdi to hold the titles of prophethood turns you out of the pale of Islam. We say, how come it? Hazrat Muhammad Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam himself, speaking of the future Messiah, says he will be Nabiullah, Nabiullah, Nabiullah. 4 times in Muslim, one tradition we find the mention like this. So, doesn't he know Islam? Who prophesies himself? So, he entitles Messiah to be Nabiullah, whatever the meaning be. That Nabiullah concept is not against Khatm Nabiullah, because that prophecy of Nabiullah was made by no less a person than Hazrat Muhammad Rasulullah, Khatamun Nabiyyin himself. So to call it at odds with Khatamun Nabiyyin is an insult to the Holy Prophet. It's like saying he didn't understand the Quran. So his understanding must prevail, and that is our understanding. So the way he described Al-Mahdi, he described it as a subordinate prophet of Allah, Mahdi guided. Mahdi means guided. Guided both by Allah and guided by his Prophet Muhammad Rasulullah. So a total subservient in Islam. That is not against Khatm Nabuwwat. And Prophet Messiah, as he mentioned, he himself called him a Nabiullah. So anyone who claims to be a Messiah and says, I am not Nabiullah, what should be the reaction of the Ummah? They should reject him. Is to say, what sort of Messiah are you? You say you are Messiah and not Nabiullah. Hazrat Muhammad Rasulullah said, Messiah and Nabiullah. Whom should we believe? Obviously Hazrat Muhammad Rasulullah. So this is only a difference in verbs, in terminology, and unnecessary quarrel. We believe in the finality of Islam. We believe in the finality of Hazrat Muhammad Rasulullah as the last law-bearing prophet whose word will continue to live and remain operative till the end of the time. These are the major areas of differences. Again, there are many differences about in the smaller areas, like the concept of angels. We don't believe the angels have literal wings. We know from the Quran that the word wing is used to indicate attributes. So some angels have more attributes, some have less attributes. They are spiritual beings. They don't have human dimensions. They're not material like we are. So don't dispute the nature of angels unnecessarily. We have no knowledge. We must believe in general that angels do exist. And similarly, we don't believe that the same body of the man will be resurrected after death. We believe that a new spiritual body would be created by Allah out of the same soul which we possess here. And if you insist on the same body, then some people are born with ugliness, some people have one leg or one arm or none, and some people are born without eyes. So if they have to be resurrected exactly as they existed in the world, what a hell it would be for them to be thrown into the Jannah, limping around or not being able to walk, carried around and so on. Uglies would be the uglies would be the uglies, and the beautiful would enjoy the beauty. That is no way of enjoying heaven at all. So we believe these are spiritual things, spiritual terminology. This is how Imam Mahdi was guided by Allah. He told us these beautiful truths. He said, you will be resurrected in the form of that soul, which was formed by your good acts or bad acts. If your bad acts created an ugly soul, your new personality will be extremely ugly and full of sores and diseases. If you have been good here and you have been healthy here, your soul will emerge as a beautiful being with all the characters which you enjoyed and exercised here in this life. So there are differences, of course, of understanding in so many areas. If you read about all the differences, then it is not necessary for you to debate the issue on the knowledge of this and knowledge of that. Your conscience should be the final judge. It will immediately see where the truth lies and where it does not.
That's absolutely.
You come to me